on page of the register and right on that. Yeah. Well, I don't know, supposed to be different on how they where we hire. And you don't want to write those steps yourself, right? That's no fun.
I think that's commercial. She Saturday trying to catch it.
Trying to catch her cheese. Oh. That one.
DUI. The keys were running away from her and she's gone. It happened before the holidays.
Me too.
There we go. Like, beautiful line.
I still like the Jack here. 1860, I don't know. The guy says to us, I wish your uncle or your brother would leave. He's got Jack's beer out of the refrigerator. He's walking out. And she says, I thought he was your brother.
All right, nice and warm in here. All right, how's everybody doing this fine new year? Yeah, but this is my new wool suit that my daughter got me in London. With her friends and family discount from the shop she was. Nice and warm. I don't think I'll be wearing the wool a little later this year. It's definitely a winter suit. All right, so Diana was asking, are we done with the book? We are done with Christian Hope. But I will say, because we skipped over, there were 2 chapters toward the end where he really, and I really debated with myself because I think it's important. I think it's important as a worshiping community that we locate our practice of hope sacramentally, right? And we're going to do that today when we reaffirm the hope of our baptism, right? But the other place that the table, Karl Barth called the Lord's table, that is the parousia. And the parousia is a Greek word for, the end of time, right? It is where Christ meets us. It is where we are met by the saints. We are surrounded by the saints at the table. Christ meets us at the table. It is our hope. Our hope is there. Our hope is in the restoration of community that is represented by the table, right? Our hope isn't in, it's interesting. So we were flipping around trying to find a new show because we're like the end of all of our shows. We finished everything. And I've been kind of intrigued. I've known about this show, this program. It was about 10 years old. I had never seen it. It was an HBO program called The Leftovers. And the premise, it's based on a novel, but the premise is that there has been a rapture-like occurrence, a departure of 2% of the human population. But it is not a religious show. It does, however, at least from the pilot, begin to touch on how this kind of story is fodder cult-like activity, right? It's fairly cultish. And I don't want to say that everybody who's a dispensationalist is a cultist, but I will say that I think that, to borrow Grady's term, the fan fiction distracts us, right? We get caught up in conspiracies and Israel, right? Building a people and Armageddon and Antichrist. And we forget that we don't, the font and the table. It's as simple as that. Right? Our hope is in Jesus Christ. And we are met at the font and the table of Jesus Christ. We don't have to go to Megiddo. We don't have to go to Israel. I'll tell you a story sometime. I tell it all the time about how I thought I had to go to Israel. I had to go to the Holy Land to meet Jesus. And he met me on a plane in Minneapolis airport. I'm absolutely convinced. I mean, that traveling nurse was Jesus as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so I'm going to talk. So January, Build Sunday School. I know that Jen Routman is going to teach some classes going forward. And these are going to be largely spiritual practice?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Matthew, I think I talked to a couple of people, maybe I'll send out the schedule.
okay.
It's about the middle of August.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. But so, it's funny that I brought up that story about, so the trip that I was taking where Jesus met me on the plane, I was going to Holy Land on pilgrimage. And so we did a lot of work prior to this trip. It was a pilgrimage. On spiritual practice. And one of the spiritual practices that we talked about that has been very instructive in my life is it's called the daily exam. And it's, you see it spelled EXAMEN. The daily examen. And this is a spiritual practice that was really kind of instituted by Ignatius of Loyola. And those of you who, I don't know if you know, Ignatius of Loyola is the founder of the Jesuit order, Society of Jesus. So if you see SJ, that's what it means, Society of Jesus, these are Jesuits. The Pope, current Pope is Jesuit. And the thing that I admire about Ignatius is that in some ways the Ignatian movement was an answer to the Reformation. It's part of the Counter-Reformation, right? And some people say that Presbyterians like Jesuits because Jesuits are the closest that Catholics come to being Presbyterian. But I will say that the Jesuits have one up on us because while the Jesuits, like the Presbyterians, like the Reformed tradition, are very committed to the life of the mind, they are also very committed to the life of the spirit. Ignatius' spiritual exercises, the Examen prayer, don't allow people of faith to only live in their heads, right? Which is the danger that we run as people of the Reformation. I love me some Calvin, and Calvin was a scholar, and I wear a scholar's robe on Sunday, but the commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and your strength, right? And so cultivating that spirit. So I like to use this book. This is the book that I was given. It's called Sleeping with Bread. The subtitle is Holding What Gives You Life. The authors are a married couple and their brother, who is a Jesuit priest. But the title comes from a story, and maybe I'll just read you from the book, because it's really quite good. What they mean. Okay, yes. During the bombing raids of World War II, thousands of children were orphaned and left to starve. The fortunate ones were rescued and placed in refugee camps where they received food and good care. But many of these children who had lost so much could not sleep at night. They feared waking up to find themselves once again homeless and without food. Nothing seemed to reassure them. Finally, someone hit upon the idea of giving each child a piece of bread to hold at bedtime. Holding their bread, these children could finally sleep in peace. All through the night, the bread reminded them, today I ate, and I will eat again tomorrow. The Examen prayer is essentially a way of resting in the awareness that I was met by and fed by God today, and I will be met by and fed by God tomorrow. So here's how you do this, right? It's really simple. The Examen prayer is about taking an inventory of your day. Simply coming to the end of your day and reviewing your day. What happened? And as you review the events of your day, you have two questions that you're with which you're through which you're filtering the events of your day. Where did I feel God was present to me? And where did I feel God was absent? Right? Very simple. So here's how it would work when my kids were small, because this is the practice that we did at that time. We had a candle, and we would light the candle. We would just say, the light shines in the darkness. Darkness does not overcome. And then I would ask Grace or Miranda, what was the best thing that happened to us? That's what I said. So that we would talk a little bit about their day. And I say, what was the hardest thing about it? What was the hardest part? Talk about that. And then we would thank God for this. And we would ask God to help the hard stuff. And we would let the good stuff fill us up. And we would let the bad stuff go. And then I think, God, I don't know about Ford Museum or it's like a farm in Michigan, a friend took me to. But anyway, we got these handmade candles. We had a little candle stand, and I got a little metal snuffer. Kids love the snuffer. So that was over. Thank you, God, for this. Help me, God, with that. Let the good fill me up. Let the bad go. Rest in the love of God. Now, here's the thing. That seems really simple, right? It's hard. I don't know about you. First of all, I don't have total recall. And I get to the end of my day and I'm like, I'm just ready to go to bed.
Wait.
Right?
Let's forget the past.
And this is one of those, and so one of the things that was said about this is that, during the time when the Jesuit order was first coming into being and Ignatius was training members of the order, there was a lot of traveling going on, as Counter-Reformation, and he would advise members of the order in the busyness of what they were doing. Even if you can't attend to all the other prayers, do the Examen. Like that is the essential prayer. And to the point of the story, it's a way of cultivating spirit over time, right? It's a prayer practice that trains us to look for God, right? We begin by trying to look for where God was. But what happens is over time, the practice of remembering and tending to where God was heightens our awareness of where God is in this. And even where God isn't, we may say, because one of the kind of phrases that embodies Ignatian spirituality is God in all things, right? the Ignatian spirituality does not recognize the distinction between sacred and secular. That is a human construction. As the psalmist would say, the world is God's and all that is, right? It all belongs to God. Now that gets really hard because there's some places in this world that feel very bereft, right? We can think of them, we can name them. Gaza is certainly one of them. Ukraine is another one. Those are the big ones that are in the headlines. There are plenty of others that we probably don't know about, don't hear about, that are equally painful. And what that does, though, is that it propels us into the arms of God, right? That the places where we feel that God is absent cause us to cry out to God, right? Instead of seeing them as an occasion for doubt or distrust, they become an opportunity for us to draw closer to God, to say, where are you? This is horrible. Where do I go? But it also then heightens our awareness of maybe how God is present in really simple things, right? I have this theory that I'm working on. It's not fully formed, so I apologize, but I think it's made more pronounced by the media culture and the new media, internet, kind of instant information all the time, that if something doesn't rise to the level of a viral video or, fame or celebrity or newsworthiness, okay? Yeah, I'm trying to think of all the categories that generally occupy our attention, right? What I have observed is that we're creating a whole generation that believes that if my life or the things in it don't rise to that level, then they are somehow deficient. The practice of the examen, the idea that God is in all things, is a way of spiritually engaging the world that says that criteria, excuse my language, is crap. That criteria is empty, and ultimately hollow, right? I always think in movies. I love the movie Notting Hill anyway, but I love the moment towards the end of the movie where she comes back to his shop and basically says, do you want to be my boyfriend or whatever? You want to be my person? And he's like, I'll pass. It's like I just don't. There's just too much of you everywhere. And she says, is it the fame thing? Because it's not real. Right? The problem is it's been made real in the minds of so many people. And so what a spiritual practice like this does is kind of punctures that myth. It says, no, getting up in the morning is a resurrection.
Yeah, for sure. And she's really good, and this is what we're going to do. At this time, do you think the time you wrote it down, we were all of us right now, and then we looked back like a month at this time, we had let go, back,
right?
Do you think that's helpful? I want
yes.
to look back just a little simple. Say I prayed,
right.
This is why.
Well, here's a variation on it, and I think it's very helpful because several years back when I first got here, we did something for a while called the Ultimate Happy Hour. It was mostly geared towards young adults, and we just kind of met for beer. But the idea is we were going to talk about ultimate questions. And so originally, I handed out slips of paper and I said, what's your ultimate question? What was interesting is the first time we met, I want to say half of the questions without consulting one another. Now, granted, these are young adults, right? How do I know what I'm supposed to do? It was a question of vocation, right? How do I, and this is where, so I talked to you about a daily practice, it's about reviewing. But ultimately what you come to, and this is the point of the subtitle, holding on to what gives you life. You can reframe the question of where was God present, like I did for my kids. What was the best part of your day? What was the worst part of your day? If you do it with youth groups, it's always yums and yucks or highs and lows. I mean, if anybody spent any time with youth, there's always the section where we talk about highs and lows, right? There's also, and this is one of the things that I think I particularly appreciate about Ignatian spirituality is that it is very much about engaging the imagination, right? And one of, this is not related to the Examen, but to give you an example, one of the things that you'll often come across in Ignatian spiritual exercises is the practice of taking a piece of scripture and then imagining yourself there. And if you go through a spiritual direction with some of these Ignatian, you'd be like, what does it smell like? What does it sound like? They'll like engage the senses imaginatively in order to locate you in the text so that it's no longer words on a page. It's something that you're trying to step into. It's a word that you're trying to incarnate, to use a phrase. Similarly, with the Examen, if you do it over time, you probably will start to recognize certain patterns, right? You will recognize the things that give you life and the things that do not, right? It's interesting. I was just reading, I read a blog by a guy who's not a spiritual writer. His name's Seth Godin, but he was talking about, I can't even remember I just remember this final line where he was like, he's talking about tools and, he's talking about technology and the way that certain people don't adopt technology either because they see what it represents and they don't want to be a part of it, or they don't know what it can do and so they don't take part of it, right? He says and he talks about how Amish will do this. They'll sometimes select somebody in the community to adopt the technology and to report back to the community what its effect was, and generally make a decision about whether or not to incorporate it or not. And, most of the time it's to not, because they recognize or they feel like it does not make things better, does not give them life, right? And he makes the observation that for a lot of people, social media does not give them life. In fact, quite the opposite, and yet it's still engaging, right? But when it comes to the idea of discernment, when it comes to the idea of how do I know what I'm supposed to do? How do I know what kind of what decision to make in this instance? The Examen invites you as a practice of discernment to imagine, how will I feel if I pick this? And then to imagine. Conversely, how will I feel if I pick that? And oftentimes, like, we had an opportunity once, a long time ago, Maria and I when we first got into this, you need to discern calls, right? And we were in conversation with the church, and we had kind of gotten up to kind of a final selection kind of thing, and we didn't know, and then they called us and said, we decided to call somebody else. And Marie was like, and I was like, well, that's all I needed to know. right? Like, is this a call or is it a call? Well, if they call and say yes, how are you going to feel? Conversely, if they call and say no, how are you going to feel? You can know before you get that call whether or not you're being called, right? Annie Lamott gives a great example of this in her book, Operating Instructions. I don't know how many of you know her story. Annie Lamott's a very well-regarded writer who has written in the Christian realm. She's out in San Francisco, so she's a little out in San Francisco. But she became pregnant. Now, she was as left can be, right? And, pro-choice, yada, yada, yada. And then she finds herself pregnant. And she doesn't know what to do. And she's walking with her Jesuit friend who says, imagine how you'll feel if you choose to terminate this pregnancy. And conversely, imagine how you'll feel if you choose not to. And, here's this woman who's very pro-choice, she said, the second I imagined terminating pregnancy, my heart broke. And I knew it was going to be hard, but she carried the child to term, right? She raised him. And I think and that's not to advocate for one way, decision or another, it's just to say, these are ways, like, you could call it intuition, but it is really about spiritual attunement. It's what spiritual discernment is about, is attuning ourselves to the presence of God, what gives us life, right? Because prologue to John. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was God. Through him all things were made, not one thing that was made. What came into being in him was light, and the light was the light of all people, right? What gives us light? God in Christ gives us light. Those places that give us light are places where we are met by God, right? It gives me light. So imagining what will give you light. There's another way of doing this that casts way forward, particularly when it comes to vocational decisions. And I know that a lot of you are retired, but it doesn't just have to be a vocational decision. But the book talks about imagining yourself at the end of your life. And thinking about what it is you would, all the things that have given you life, or that will give you life, this sounds like a very conventional kind of juxtaposition, but we make decisions vocationally all the time to do things that pay the bills, but that, rob us of our lives. I just read it. Internet memes are mixed bag, but I thought this was really good. It's like self-care is about more than baths and something else. Self-care is about cultivating a life that you don't have to feel like you have to escape from. Right? Which is another way of saying a life that gives you life, in which you were given life, and a life, as opposed to one that steals your life, steals your joy.
Check it all the time. I think
I'm surprised why this is daily.
it should, right?
Absolutely.
I think a lot of my friends right now, we're all in that having careers for 20 plus years, right? And love what we do.
Right.
Or are we choosing to think,
well, and
we're do something else?
We're Gen X, right? So being in a career for 20 years is a little bit of an anomaly. And it is certainly, as you millennial Gen Z, you know, these generations, the concern that I have is they're in such flux that I worry that it's all flux, right? It's not grounded in anything. I think that's also part of this.
Sure, it's like our kids, right? They get all these messages, and you were talking about that, like social media and stuff. Our kids are definitely in that spot. You know, at Manal, they talk about college a lot, right? Both of our boys go there, and all these kids, they feel all this pressure to choose a career, and they get mixed messages from social media. You know, do this, try this, this is great, or you do that.
It's all about- Look at the graduate. right?
Yeah.
Exactly, it's perennial, exactly. I mean,
It does seem like there's a lot of pressure applied these days.
right,
Social media,
well, and
all the media stuff we were talking.
it depends on the environment. I'm not to pick on anybody. But I have concern about Concord Plus. Because they have a suicide problem that's or has suicide. I don't know that it's been as bad recently. And my hope is that they recognize that there was something about the environment in that school that was leading kids to despair, deep despair. And I think some of that can take place in terms of it can be academic pressure, it can be social pressure, this idea that to quote Lyle Lovett, one bad move turns your whole world upside down, right? That you're so worried about. Sorry, y'all, this is how I teach. I don't get it. I'm just one random association after another. But I'm thinking about this. This will mean nothing to most of you, but I'm thinking about the Denver Broncos and their quarterback situation.
Yeah.
They paid a boatload of money to this guy who was really successful. And if you look at his statistics for this year, they're pretty good, except they haven't quite won. And this is simply my perception. What I see is somebody who's very careful. You know, and you can be so careful, so afraid of not messing up that you never thrive either. You're simply here. But it's hard, right? I mean, let me give you an example of another random association. Sorry. Yes.
I think not just being careful, I think it's this drive to be perfect that sets up a fear that you won't be perfect and you avoid trying.
Right.
And I see that a lot
See it in my house.
in teenagers, and I just spent a couple of days on vacation with my college age grandchildren, and there's so much competition. And they're competing with the world, or we compete in our neighborhood, or
Right.
looking for jobs, or looking for school.
And that perfection is so expected this day and age. It seems to me. It's like 50 years ago, you went about your business and you stumbled and you fell and it was,
That's just
This is what happened.
I guess she felt there was still opportunity out there.
Right.
And now there's a sense of scarcity about resources in the world and on the earth and here. It was really, interesting to be around them, and they're so my granddaughters went home vacation studying with the cats. Those hours and hours studying on this.
What's the alternative to perfection is living in space. There's both.
That's fair.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to see this because, I'm not just senior college, more was going on. You're thinking maybe about career, which I find it out, and live with your boyfriend, and your parents. What was the stronger drugs? So so it's, it was just so interesting, the difference in time. And it wasn't like there was just joy. My grandson made, 4 A's and B as a freshman. And they thought he made dean's list. They were so excited when they realized that's the school that she had, not arts and science. I'm like, guys, I never guys. So I went my diploma because I fell in love with Robert, and my grade point that struck a little bit. And she was like 1,000 or something when they gave me a blank thing and said, I'm repeating, to graduate honors. It was just sort of like, it was just a whole different tension and anxiety that they had.
Right.
But to this point, that this has been forever, because I'm in a book club right now.
Yeah.
And we're reading again the school statement.
Ah.
And what's really is other than it's like, whatever you do, make sure that your patient, anybody going to Christianity, the same sort of patient, is not aware that these fluctuations is what the enemy, what we call God's enemy, what the enemy designed. And like you gotta keep the patient focused on no, those downtimes, that's wrong. No, and it's like that's just what we're for.
Yeah.
And the letters are all about make sure the patient is not self-aware. Don't let them start thinking. Make them feel, make them understand.
Right.
Well, two is going on. Right. And we're sitting there instead like,
Yeah.
he couldn't make this. And I think like what brings to me is, at least for us, for me, it's like how do we define where God is and where God isn't? And what I learned is that it's not that, like God is everywhere. There's no place God is not. So it's like, what is it in my life that is keeping me from being aware that God is? And so then it comes back to me about being self-aware. I'm like defining my world. What are the rules that I'm throwing on myself, the pressures that I'm throwing on myself that keep me from being able to experience God in a way that I've never imagined? And that's what the whole Spirit is about, right?
This brings up the thing that it starts talking, imagining what you did today. You don't have to imagine it, just remember it.
Yeah.
That's basically it. And, you hear me once in a while saying, "Oh, this theology nonsense. You don't need to worry about it." You've heard that once or twice. It's a personal thing. It is. It's all about how you do and how you feel.
Yeah. And now my defense will be, Bruce,
Okay.
is that theology gives me the vocabulary to articulate what you're describing.
And you need that particularly.
No, you don't get as much. And my job is almost to teach you this language.
Yeah.
To help contextualize what you're experiencing. Not to tell you what to experience or how to feel, but to say this thing that you are feeling or this experience that you're having, here are some words, here are some images, here are some stories. Stories. Well, and that's why we have the Bible to say we have these stories, and it's like Screwtape 1940, but you can go back to Jacob at the River Jabbok. Simon Lane wrote his college essay about the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel as a way of talking about his own faith. Right? Stories resonate. That's what we're looking for. And we can look in the stories of things that give life and things that take life. Right? I tell people this all the time. I think I preached it not too long ago. The commandments. Commandments are not God's recipe to ruin your good time. Right? Oh, thou shalt not, oh man, I can't do that either. Oh, I can't, oh man, God, you just wreck everything. No, God's like, this is what will give you life. Stay away from this. Stay away from that. Cultivate this. Honor the Sabbath. Honor your, it's the guardrails. It's like, well, I will tell you, I do not enjoy a drive on a mountain road when there's no guardrail. Right? But if there is, I am far more relaxed and able to enjoy the scenery because I know that a guardrail has been established to keep me from plunging to my death. And the commandments are no different. And the examen is another way of, it personalizes, right? And says, some days the thing that gives me life may be the thing that the next day is the thing that steals my life. And then I have to say, what changed? Right? What changed me? The examen prayer is an act of self-awareness, but it's also an act of God-awareness. That's what makes it a spiritual practice. It's a both and, right? Where was I met by God? Where did I not feel met by God? Well, wait a minute, why? What is it about? And sometimes there's injustice in the world. And I experience it firsthand. And I feel like God is not present to me. And I cry out. Because that's what the story tells us to do too, right? That's what people in the Bible do, cry out. That's the psalmist does. The majority of the Psalms are the psalmist crying out to God.
When you're crying out, that is, God's present.
But
you're not feeling it.
Right, because the psalmist is like, where did you go?
But he's there.
Right. Well, it's somebody will point out, you only say, where did you go to someone who was there, right?
Frank used to say, the psalmists are like country western music.
They are.
If bad things happen, then all of a sudden at the end, everything's okay.
Usually, that's all they do.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I love that joke. You heard that joke? Yeah, the country record, you play it backwards, and your wife comes back, and your dog comes back to life. It's like all the bad things that happen in the countryside. So those are some of the applications for this. Let me just kind of, have any of you done a version of this or had an experience with this that you want to share?
Well, last summer when I was in the hospital and I could go in differently and the emergency room was crazy. I called you and I'm like, yes, and you called. And it was so interesting to hear you say this today because you asked me, well, where do you sense the presence of God? And I remember going, I don't know. But it was really so helpful because from that moment on, in the midst of the chaos and everything, you wanted to be brought back. It goes down. I was able to appreciate what people were doing instead of what they did. And that puts you in a better place of mind to interact with other people and appreciate your skills. And also realize they were so short staffed. Or stop or to construct.
Right.
But it was, it was just amazing because I can remember Mike got to see every bit of it. Now, where do you sense God? Oh yeah.
It reminds me of yours what you just described too, like where you found the song. It reminds me of the kind of the trope that we sadly have come to hear too often. But Mr. Rogers' thing about looking for the helpers, right? When things fall apart and it feels like it's in chaos, where's God? 9/11, where's God? Well, God is in people who went into those buildings to save other people's lives. People who helped each other through it. I turned to this and I thought, oh, well, this would be a good thing to talk about. This is a good time, examine of the past year um, to look back on the last 12 months and to say, what gave me life? And also what didn't. As a way of looking forward, right? So of maybe saying, you know, this thing that used to give me life, I discovered in the past years not working. I need to change. God to direct me to, you know, and to use this spiritual practice as a way of how we, whether it's a vocational decision, you know, and it's hard for me. I hear you describe your granddaughter studying for the MCATs, and part of me, well, the honest part of me is like, God, that sounds awful. Probably because that's why I'm not a doctor. Because that sounds awful. But I'm really grateful for people who are licensed in medicine who spent maybe their holiday studying for the MCAT, because that ultimately, well, that particular experience of studying may not give them life. The idea of serving and helping people medically does. And so that larger thing enables you to make it through the hard stuff. Because you're like, okay, I know that this is in pursuit of something that will be. I'll give you a really good example of in retrospect. Actually, it wasn't in retrospect. I spent a lot of time, too much time, thinking about this. I think most of you know my story. So I was a child actor. I did my first professional show when I was 10 years old. I would ride in the van with professional actors, and so I would ask them what's the best college to go to if you want to be an actor. And I remember in junior high, I was saying Carnegie Mellon, so that was always my goal. Carnegie Mellon, that's going to go. So I, you know, continued to act and dance and sing, and I auditioned, and I was accepted to the Carnegie Mellon theater program. And you know, like a lot of things, it's one thing to be good where you're from. It's an entirely different thing to go where everybody who's there was good where they're from. It's a whole different environment. And it was hard. And I thought I was doing great. Came to the end of my first semester and I was on probation. Came to the end of my second semester, I was put on final probation. And then I thought I figured out that midway through my third semester, my beginning of sophomore year, and they put these. Remember before the electronics, they were bulletin boards. They put these letters on the bulletin board for you, and so I would just read those letters. And so, like midway through my third semester, I was like, "Screw it, I'm out. Transferring out of this department. I'm going to go into humanities." I went into humanities for a semester, but it just happened to be the year that they were doing a lot of musicals on the main stage, and they needed men who could dance. And I fit that category, so I got to do a show on the main stage, even though I wasn't a student in the program. And I had a blast. It gave me life. And so I said, going back. And so I petitioned to re-enter the program. Like, okay, well, you have to restart your sophomore year. And then I petitioned, since I had already done that first semester of the sophomore year, if I couldn't take some humanity classes. And no, you have to be in the program. You're in the program, in the program. And about halfway through the semester, I got a letter. And this was not. And it was, I don't think it was a bluff. I don't know, it was something that a 19-year-old would do. I wrote them a letter. And I said, if it's your intention to cut from the program, do it at the break. don't keep me around for your spring musical CD bodies. And they called my bluff. And I was asked to withdraw from the program at the end of that midway through my, what was then my third year. And I spent a lot of time thinking I knew something then that I realize now that it was intuitive, it wasn't cognitive. And that was that the pursuit of a life as a professional actor would not give me life. It would steal my life in a lot of ways that I wasn't. I think I knew that. And I didn't want to admit it out loud. And I realize now, one of the reasons why I know I wasn't is because what I've seen from my friends who've gone on to have careers in the performing arts is that you have to hear what I was receiving in those letters all the time and still believe you have something to go on. You have to not hit the part more often. Still believe that you have something wrong. And I don't know that I had. But I think at the time, I wish I could have, I think part of me was imagining. Like I was imagining having a family. And then I was imagining, what would that look like as somebody who had to travel to work all the time? I don't know that I would like it, right? It was a spirit, there's a spiritual discernment at work. What is giving you life? So what's great is, so here's a little announcement. The only person who knows this is Caleb. Theater still gives me life. It's just not my job. So in March, I am going to be in the principal role of Baker in Music Theater Southwest's production of Musical Plays. Cool. And I've begun rehearsal, and I really love it. And it's really great. So, but to me, it's an example. I think everybody has a story, right? Oh, this thing, and so we can look back. That's what the example is, and say, oh, God was good at the end. That's less good at the end. You know where God was with me at Carnegie Mellon? I had a great campus fellowship group. I had really good Christian friends who were not in that department, who sustained me. And the funny thing is I left Carnegie Mellon and I stopped going to church for 4 years. Well, I didn't have my friends. I didn't have my community. But I remembered what gave me life. And I came back to the church. Right? Sometimes it's remembering what gives you life. Yeah. Thoughts, questions, concerns, stories. Anybody want to share anything?
Sometimes I want to be here. That's when I look back at this all the time. I want to go back to the examen. Having grown up as a Catholic, it's kind of interesting when you're trying to teach children, you're a strict nun, and you tell them, examine your conscience every night. So anyway.
Yeah, this is a different version of that. It's interesting because this can reveal things. If you like, this is not giving me life, or I did not feel met by God here, and it might have something to do with my own sin, right? I mean, that is an examen of conscience as well. And we don't like to talk about sin because it's such a bummer, but it's a reality. To say, maybe I need to look at this. You know, if I'm not being met by God, maybe this is not something that's good for me. Right?
I'm glad you brought it up, because when I think about when you did this Bible study, you life differently. You know, because I went into it thinking, how am I going to answer and ask this question at the end of the day? Right? Like, how am I? So everything I did and every way I interacted with people was affected by how I was thinking about these questions and this time with God. And sitting here thinking about it, that right now, you know, I say my good prayers at the end of the day, but I don't think about how God is in all aspects of my life. And am I really, you know, so it definitely has inspired me to do it again. It's a great way to find that peace and calm and really look at your life, stand back and
I feel like you have something to say.
I have not looked at it as an exam type experience, but my whole life has been led by God. And haven't said, oh, this is God taking me here, or at least not originally, not when I was a teenager.
Right.
But I thought I wanted to be a nurse, and I went to nursing school, and I was having a miserable time, and I fought with the dean, and and then I had a really bad experience in the hospital. And I said, I'm not going to do this. And I am so glad. Really was not. And
Now, where you were called.
Or where I was called. When I became a flight attendant, I was so happy. And then I started paying attention to where God was leading me and what God wanted me to do in this position. But strange position. God, what are you putting me here for?
Right.
And I found lots of ways every day to bring God into what I do. And it gave me life.
Yes.
It really gave me life.
That's it. Cultivating that awareness. That's the point of the spiritual practice. That's why we pray, right? Another great Lewis quote. I think about it in the movie. I'm sure you wrote it somewhere. But in the movie Shadowlands, at one point, it's about C.S. Lewis, and one of his colleagues says, he has some good news. He's like, oh, this is wonderful news. I know how hard you've been praying. And to which Lewis says, I don't pray to change God. I pray and God changes me. Right? Cultivating that spiritual awareness changes us. Thank you, everybody. Looking, how many early, were there anybody here at early service? Oh yeah, you guys. Come and get wet. Oh, that's the Lord's Sunday. That's okay. You won't do that.
We should not have smoke.
Well, I want you to know.
Yeah.
In our bulletin, we have this thing, and it's about First Presbyterian Church. Is that your church?
Oh, the service of Christianity.
Hi.
Yeah.